Hi guys, welcome back. Today we have another mini lesson. I want to introduce one of my favorite things that we read all year, Beowulf. Beowulf is cool because it's like the beginning of all superhero epics. Beowulf is like the first epic hero, and then Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, every sort of comic book hero from, even modern times stems from the idea of sorry, of Beowulf as this mighty, amazing hero. So, what we have to do is we have to go way back to the Anglo Saxon period, which was from 449 to 1066. And I'm going to teach you a little bit about the history leading up to this point and who Beowulf was and some things you need to know about the reading. So, I asked you to take notes as you're listening to this presentation. And I think that will really help you as we read the text and then also for you to put it in that historical context. Okay, so this may seem like it says Beowulf the Great, or maybe it looks like I made a typo, but it's not. Beowulf is a Geat. That's where he's from. He's from Geatland, and so he is a Geat, just so you know. Okay, let's get started. Slowly, let's get started. Here we go. Okay. In the time that Beowulf was living, life centered around ancestral tribes or clans that rule themselves. And initially, people were warriors from invading outlying areas. So basically, these four groups of people invaded England and set up tribes and like makeshift kingdoms in England. And there were the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Danes. Well, you can kind of tell which two groups were the most important because this is called the Anglo-Saxon period. And so there you go. In fact, because the Angles and the Saxons were so big, they started calling England Angleland, and that's where we get modern day England. So, all right, we talked about that. Here's a map showing like where the Angles and the Jutes and the Saxons were coming from. They were coming from like those Norwegian, Scandinavian areas over to England, and they created their own little kingdoms. They invaded in 449. Germanic invaders took over the southern part of the island and called it Angleland. Several small tribal kingdoms that lack of written language, and they're polytheistic, so they worship multiple gods, and they were basically farmers, hunters, and warriors. During the 1500s and 1600s, Scandinavian tribes invaded and settled England, and they were told stories of these warriors' bloody conquest and how they took over the island to begin with. What makes Beowulf the work significantly different from these other works is not the portrayal of warfare, but the exaltation of peace and peacekeeping through the rule of powerful kings. Beowulf itself is about a powerful king, Hrothgar, who invites Beowulf to come and save their kingdom by killing off these monsters, and they end up making peace and that kind of thing. All right, Christianity kind of changes everything. So in 596, missionaries attempt to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. And by 650, most of England is Christian, at least in title, although many hold on to pagan beliefs and traditions. In the 7 and 800, Danes and Norsemen invade Britain, and by 850, most of England is taken over. Christianity changes everything because Christians, missionaries, were the people who were educated so they could write. So the story of Beowulf has been passed down since the Angles and Saxons invaded, so 449, but the story wasn't actually written down until hundreds of years later because it was still being told around the fires and at night, but these Christian missionaries actually were the first people to write it down, which is part of a discrepancy you'll see. The missionaries changed parts of the Old Norse story to represent more of like a Christian view. They didn't want this story of gods and hell and monsters and all that stuff being written and told anymore, and so they kind of changed some things. And you'll see that when we read, you'll see the discrepancies. Okay. Here's a picture of kind of what they would be wearing. It's actually a real Roman too. Warfare, the threat of warfare, is a popular part of Anglo-Saxon life. Kings gave riches to their bravest warriors to guarantee their loyalty, and Anglo-Saxons believed in mystical creatures such as monsters and dragons. They believed in all kinds of creatures and that they were all part of like the evil in this world. All right. Swords were a big part of their mythology too. They were intricately decorated. They were gifts that symbolized the worthiness of a warrior. And then some were given names, such as Beowulf's sword is called Runting. The H is silent, kind of in the king's name, Hrothgar, which you'll see here in a minute. It starts with an H too. It was swords are passed down from father to son, from king to their loyal subjects, or they're captured in battle. They were part of like that clan or that family. Something you do see in Game of Thrones too, if you watch Game of Thrones. Okay, so as these warriors become settled in England, they have to become different because they've already, conquered. So what do you do after you conquer a place? Well, you got to settle it. So they became agriculturally based and they started farming and creating government and fine crafts. And then the small kingdoms developed into seven large ones. You do not need to know the names of the seven large ones. My gosh. Because you have seven kingdoms, there needs to be a unified way to communicate. And so finally, a language was developed, Old English. Old English comes from the need for these different groups of people to be able to communicate across kingdom lines. You would think that Old English is like what Shakespeare was writing in, but it's not at all. And we'll see that in a minute. They lived close to their animals to protect them and also to provide warmth. And they lived in little single family homes, but all the homes surrounded a giant communal hall, often called a mead hall. Mead is like an alcohol made from honey, from fermented honey. And so the mead hall is where everybody would get together and drink and tell stories and that kind of stuff. So here's like food. Yay. Bread, meat, cheese, eggs, that kind of stuff. All right, so characteristics of Anglo-Saxons, they were hard fighters and bold sea warriors. They had come over from across the ocean and conquered this land. What did they admire? Physical strength, bravery, loyalty, fairness, and honesty. They had a great love of personal freedom, so you don't see a lot of government control. They were boastful, reckless, cruel, and bloodthirsty, and they enjoyed conflict. I mean, think about it. When you really don't have TV or music or books and no one reads or writes, what do you do for fun? Well, you compete and you tell stories about your competitions. So swimming matches, horse races, banqueting, drinking mead, which is that fermented beverage we talked about, singing songs, and storytelling. They also had the original like yo mama jokes with flighting, which was a conflict of wits between two warriors where each praises his own deeds or belittles the other. Like, oh, I'm so amazing. Look what I did. You're so stupid. Look what you did. That kind of thing. That's called flighting. And actually, when I think about Anglo-Saxons, I think a lot about How to Tame Your Dragon. I don't know if y'all have seen that movie. Such a good movie. But in that culture, our main character isn't valued because he's not one of those strong, brave warriors. In fact, he starts to like the dragons, and so that sets him apart. Okay, so in all of their stories, there was a mythological influence because the Anglo-Saxons believed in elves, dwarves, giants, and they worshiped gods like Thor, Frigg, and many more. But actually, these myths influenced the creation of the book Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien was a learned Beowulf scholar, and he played a large part in getting Beowulf accepted as classic literature. And you'll see a lot of things that are similar between those two stories as we get into it. Here's some pictures of those Old Norse gods. Okay, so here's like a summary of what the story is going to be about. The Danes, who reside in Denmark, and Hrothgar is their king. And around the year 500 AD, an evil spirit arose in Denmark. For fear of this great evil, the great mead hall of Denmark, known as Herit, of course, they named their mead hall Herit, sat empty, and for that time, evil had triumphed over good. Well, if that's not the beginning of a story, I don't know what is. Word of this event traveled across the sea to Geatland, the home of the Geats, and specifically home to the strongest, bravest, most noble of all the Geats, Beowulf. Upon receiving the news that evil had outwitted goodness, Beowulf gathered his best warriors and set out toward Denmark to save the day. While Beowulf wanted to fight for goodness, he also wanted infamy, kind of like Achilles in the Iliad. He wanted to be known for all time as the greatest of all heroes. And then, of course, you'll have to see if he succeeds. But truthfully, we know that in every good story, good always triumphs over evil. So why do we read Beowulf, or what does it matter as far as like the literary canon goes? Well, Beowulf is both the first English literary masterpiece and the earliest European epic written in the native language other than Latin. So when you're talking about like English stories that came from England or stories that were written in some form of English, Beowulf is part of our English history. Like if you're Roman or you're Greek, then you have your own epics that stemmed from that early period. Beowulf is ours. Beowulf is a classic story of good versus evil, and it has lots of symbolism. The story survived in the form of a single fragile manuscript copied by two scribes at the end of 900. So the story started being told around 400 or 500, we can't know for sure, and wasn't written down until 900. So this was a very popular story, one that warriors wanted to hear over and over. And then, of course, the influence runs through our modern day culture in the form of films such as Lord of the Rings, The 13th Warrior, games such as Magic the Gathering, and Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, some of the things you'll notice in the story is a strong belief in fate or weird. Weird is the Anglo-Saxon word for fate, and a lot of these warriors would say things before they went off, like, "Well, if it's my fate to die, if weird, deems it so, then this is the way it'll be." You'll see in the book a juxtaposition of Christianity and paganism because, like I said, the story is very pagan. There's lots of worshiping of gods and sacrificing, but the Christian missionary who wrote it down inserted God into the work. And you'll see that it stands out like a sore thumb. The admiration of heroic warriors who prevail in battle and express religious faith and moral instruction through literature, which, of course, the missionary added. Here we go. Beowulf is the Geat, and he's going to fight three different monsters: Grendel's mother, because she's mad, and a fire-breathing dragon. So those are the three monsters that we'll face in the literature, in the text. We're actually reading an abbreviated form of Beowulf. I do have copies of the full version if you end up really liking it, but we're reading the abbreviated version where it just focuses on the three monsters, really. Some themes you'll see: light versus dark, good versus evil, hope versus despair, and knowledge versus ignorance, like any great epic. Okay, you'll also see that the work is written like a long poem. Most epics are. Why? Because they were originally told as stories. So they had to rhyme or have some sort of beat to them because otherwise people wouldn't remember them. And they needed storytellers to be able to repeat them. And so the rhyme stuck in their head like a song. And so they would remember certain lines, etc., and it became easier for them to tell the story. We got that. Epic poetry was delivered by a scop. A scop is an oral poet, performer, and historian. So the person who would, almost like a minstrel or a jester, but really a court storyteller, someone the king would value and have over, sitting in his hall and say, I'm ready to hear the story of Beowulf. And so then he would stand up and deliver that story. So where would they deliver this story? Well, the communal hall. For example, in our story, Harrod was the communal hall, but that mead hall that we talked about, and they would tell stories. They valued storytelling as equal to fighting, hunting, and farming. And you'll notice that Anglo-Saxon or Old English poetry is characterized by 4 main stresses in a line. So that, to give you an example, Shakespeare has 10 stresses in a line. So these are shorter lines, and they're divided in half by a pause or caesura. You'll just notice there's this large break in the line itself. And it's because they would pause and then the second half of the line would rhyme as well. So let me kind of show you what this looks like. All right, so see there's 4 beats in this line, which it's hard for us to pick out beats because this is written in such a language that you can't even read it. The only people who can read Old English are like Old English historians. So I'll play a little bit of this for you.
Oft sjul shaving sjaldene fratum, monigum meipum meldo setla oft her, eizo de erolas, sithan arift where thou shalt fund.
All right, so you'll notice definitely not Shakespearean English, like we can't even understand this. Actually, Shakespeare wrote in modern English. This is Old English. So we have Old English, Middle English, and then Modern English, which is what we're currently in, and also what Shakespeare was in. But you can't hardly read this. You will notice, though, you can even tell that there was lots of alliteration. What's alliteration again? Do you remember?